Our guest speaker is Dr. Ursula Goodenough, and I believe she is one of the few, maybe the only biologist that speaks on religious topics. So please correct me. But so I'm very excited to have her. I think that her perspective is going to be a really valuable addition to the course, and I'm really looking forward to hear what she has to say. So I will unmute her now, and we can begin.
Okay, so now we have a second thing, which is that if I go out of here and go into my PowerPoint, whether that's going to work. It worked in our trial, but should I go ahead and do that?
Yes.
All right, here's my PowerPoint, and here's it big. Let's go back to the beginning. Okay, so can you guys see that, and can you hear me?
We can hear you. You are not screen shared currently.
Oh, okay, so how do I do that?
You go to the upper right-hand corner of your screen. There's a little screen share button.
Upper right-hand corner.
Upper left. My apologies. Upper left-hand corner.
Upper left-hand corner. Oh yeah, there was a panel that came up, right? But I don't see it.
If you bring your mouse there, it should slide over. If you bring your mouse to the left.
I got my mouse to the left. It says new slide.
Well, you'll want to go back to Hangouts.
Oh, okay. All right, now I see you. Oh yeah, screen share was screen share. Okay. Screen share for Hangouts, and that's all I do. Select a window. Oh, desktop. Okay.
Desktop is what you want.
I'm remembering now. Okay. Desktop. Start screen share. You are screen sharing. All right. Now I'm going to get rid of you. And now can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Anybody have any problems?
No.
Okay. Hi. So I gather that Maximus sent you to read a piece I wrote some time ago on what I was calling Religiopoesis, and then another one on metaphor. And I won't ask everybody whether they read it, but I assume that's part of the deal. And in there, I talk about how scientists ought to be participating with others to consider a religious orientation that's based on our current understandings of the universe and its evolution. And that came out, and I had written a book, The Sacred Depths of Nature, which kind of provided spiritual substrate for that idea. And since then, what's happened is that a number of people, some of them in academia, as Maximus says, very few scientists actually, and we could talk about why that might be, but we've been getting together, we've had meetings, we've had listservs, and come up with various concepts of what such an orientation might look like and sound like. And what I'm going to do today is first give a presentation of what this group has come up with, which isn't the definitive religious naturalism. Everybody's ism is their own ism in this framework, but that we've put together as making sense to us. And then at the end, Maximus asked me to talk about an online group, the Religious Naturalist Association, that several of us in this project formed about 3 years ago, and what that looks like. And then I'll turn all of this off and be really happy to yak with you. So this is the kind of presentation that I'm prone to give. So we start with a very important basic understanding of human beings that is now, I think, very widely accepted, which that humans are symbolic beings and we are narrative beings. So we're unique in our use of symbolic language. Some of the other apes have capacities in this regard, like Kanzi the bonobo, but by the time a human is 2 years old, they're already well on their way to doing this amazing thing of learning language and understanding it. So the symbols we use in our language point to underlying meanings and understandings, and that was kind of the point of the metaphor piece that you were assigned, of how metaphors work, how they bring lots of underlying meanings to the actual word or sentence. And then we organize and remember these understandings as narratives. So we tell ourselves stories. The logic of explanations, descriptions, and instructions all take narrative form. So anything that you get from IKEA and you open it up, it's telling you a story of how to assemble the lawnmower. And we all gravitate to stories. You say once upon a time, and everybody kind of gets interested, wants to know what happened, what the outcome was, etc. It's just in our nature. And importantly, I would argue that what we call our I self, our consciousness, quote unquote, the being that wakes up in the morning and goes to sleep at night, that the meditative practice people tell you to try to get rid of so that you can access other parts of your mind, also takes narrative form. So we have our own biographies, our own understandings. Maximus is who he is because of his stories about himself from the past and his projections into the future, and the same for the rest of us. So this narrative focus of the human is also hugely manifest in all the religious traditions, those that we know of in the present, those that have existed in the past, and they have been existing for many millennia. Each of these traditions has a core narrative. Sometimes it's called a mythos. You can think of it as a large, comprehensive story. So traditions that you're familiar with, the Mythos of Christianity is the life and teachings of Christ. Judaism, it's the prophets and all of their adventures. Life of the Buddha, life of Muhammad. In indigenous traditions, lots of gods, Roman gods, and so on. Stories that identify, if you will, that particular religion and distinguish it from others. And then there are three components, all interrelated, but we can dissect them out as to what a practitioner does with that narrative. First, there are interpretations of the story. And in most traditions, those are embedded in the story itself and then elaborated by religious leaders. So if you go to church, there's a passage of Matthew that's read, and then there's a sermon that interprets this passage of Matthew, and so on. So interpretations. Secondly, there are spiritual responses to the mythos, and these are typically elicited by art, ceremony, ritual, and religious leaders are also very important in bringing those to the persons in the tradition. And finally, there are moral and ethical edicts. These are usually built into the fabric of the mythos, the moral of the story, and again, elaborated by religious leaders. So if you take that very thumbnail elevator version of what a religious tradition is and does, we can notice that scientific inquiry has very recently, in fact, provisioned us with what I would say is a mind-blowing new core narrative. So we can call it the history of nature, the epic of evolution, the epic of creation, the universe story, the new story. Lots of names have been given to this understanding. The term I like best is from Loyal Rue. He calls it everybody's story because it is not specific to particular geographical or historical traditions, but has come to us via investigations by persons throughout the world. So here's an outline of that story. There's the evolution of the observable universe, which began 13.8 billion years ago. It started with a singularity that let loose in the Big Bang, generating galaxies with stars. Nucleosynthesis occurs in dying stars. Supernovas resulting from those dying stars spread these new kinds of atoms. The new kinds of atoms congealed in our solar system 4.567 billion years ago, and as being a part of our Milky Way galaxy. And so we have the sun and the planet Earth. Then we have the origin of life on Earth, estimated about 3.7 billion years ago, and then biological evolution going on since then. And finally, to focus on what is of particular interest in religion, the evolution of minds, which I would put at starting with the onset of animal evolution, 550 million years ago. Social minds, minds of animals that depend on social groups, about 300 million years ago. Hominid minds about 6 million years ago, and human minds, depending on how you call it, but certainly by 160,000 years ago. So to put this in context and just sort of do it again, it's kind of fun to think about if you were going to college, what would be offered in college at these particular stages. So in the first stage, the only thing that you'd get to take courses in would be physics and mathematics. With the solar system, you'd start seeing chemistry and geology. Life, you'd have biology and ecology, where the evolution of life involves the evolution of awareness and the interdependence of creatures with one another and with the planet. And then evolution of animal minds, we start getting psychology and sociology being offered. And finally, very, very recently, the humanities. So here's a few images to get this story in your mind visually. This is a Hubble view. All of the things that you see are galaxies, each with hundreds of billions of stars in it, and there are hundreds of billions of galaxies. It's a wonderful image that just came out, a shot from Mars, showing Earth and giving us that perspective. Earth from closer in. The continents on the planet move about the speed of the rate of your fingernail growing. And 150 million years ago, the continents were all very different, with South America and Africa joined together and so on. And 450 million years ago, which is about as far back as seismologists can go with dating techniques, it looked really weird. So the origin of life from non-life, we know nothing about that. Many ideas, but maybe we'll never know exactly what happened. But something came that we can call proto-life around 3.7 billion years ago, which was presumably very primitive and had very limited abilities to keep itself going. But it evolved, and in this diagram we have many branches that lead to dead ends and go extinct. But one line kept going to about 3 billion years ago, and that's a being that we call our common ancestor. And the common ancestor then gave rise to the three huge major radiations of life on Earth: the bacteria, the eukaryotes, and the archaea. And we can posit the common ancestor quite readily because the common ancestor is predicted to have had the genetic information for many, many proteins that we now find in bacteria, eukaryotes, and archaea. They're in all three radiations. So the notion is that that gene, that information, was also present in their common ancestor. And as you probably know, these genes are completely interchangeable. You can take a gene from a bacterium and put it in a eukaryote and it works just fine, and so on. So these so-called housekeeping genes, the ones that run the store, are there in all critters today. And then what has happened during evolution has been using those genes, adding other ones to create this stupendous diversity that we now know exists on the planet today and has existed for many billions of years. So here are the three groups. The bacteria you probably know of, archaea, are an increasingly important group that used to be thought of as bacteria but now have their own lineage. And then the eukaryotes are the group to which we belong. The common ancestor then would be there from which all of these three radiations branched out. If we look just at the eukaryotes, we have many, many radiations, and I'll give you a few seconds to see if you can find where we are. Okay, yeah. So we have many, many different kinds, including some of which you're familiar with, like amoebae and plants, others not, perhaps not so familiar, fungi down there on the bottom left. And our closest living relatives, the one that we share the most immediate common ancestor with, are actually these choanoflagellates, these wonderful single-celled creatures. So from the choanoflagellates came the animals and then came the humans. Here's another one that recently came up on the web where we have all of these radiations written out more definitively, and they're just showing the eukaryotes and then keep magnifying them. So in the upper left, there's the animals, and in the first panel, that's magnified. In the second panel, to just see animals, and now you can read, "You are here." And then in the lower left, magnified again, "You are here." And then finally, "You are here," and we see Homo sapiens. So this, I hope, gives anybody who was skeptical an idea of just how much diversity and how much evolutionary change has been happening to create the plant animals and other organisms that are here on the planet. So biologically, no question, we're just another ape. But Terry Deacon has this provocative sentence: mentally, we are a whole new phylum of organism. And the human uniqueness is what I lifted up earlier, that we have this symbolic language that we come to very readily. We use that language to create a narrative self, and we have then organized countless language-based cultures that we depend on for many of our needs. These cultures are the repository for the material that we can collectively call the humanities: art, music, human history, philosophy, religions. These are created and transmitted via language-based human cultures, and they're all part of nature. So there's nothing about culture and us and everything that, to my mind, is independent of nature. We're all in it together. We just do particular things differently, but so do all other creatures. Okay, so that's the story. And a naturalist takes everybody's story seriously, takes nature seriously, and adopts the story as a core narrative. So we could call such person a vanilla naturalist. A religious naturalist is a vanilla naturalist, but he or she also does something different, that is, exploring the religious potential of this story. What's its religious potential? So, to reprise the three key axes of religious exploration that we lifted up earlier, is that the story, the mythos, is interpreted, it elicits spiritual responses, and it indicates moral, ethical orientations that one can glean from the story. So unlike what comes down to us in scripture and art and so on of religions, none of these interpretations or spiritual responses or moral ethical orientations is front-loaded into everybody's story. So they're all open to exploration, to development, and so on. And that's the part that I find particularly exciting. So what I'm going to do in the next few slides is suggest the kinds of things that this story is open to on these three axes. So starting with the interpretive axis entails asking the big questions along philosophical or existential or hermeneutic, however, whatever you want to do, axes. For example, how does everybody's story inform my experience of being a self? What does it tell me about free will, death, love, the search for the meaning of life? Why is there anything at all rather than nothing? The spiritual axis entails exploring inward religious experiences to everybody's story. And these include awe and wonder, gratitude, assent, commitment, humility, reverence, joy, and the astonishment of being alive at all. And then the moral. Where do human moral understandings come from? A theist would say they come from God by whatever name. A philosopher might say that they come from human reason. The version of being a religious naturalist that I'm suggesting holds that it's natural for humans to be pro-social. And Frans de Waal, an important primatologist, has a wonderful phrase where he talks about the antiquity of our moral sense. So in the chimps and the bonobos, most of these pictures are bonobos, they have very organized social groups. They're organized on the basis of hierarchy, of reciprocity, and very similar to the kinds of structures that we use to organize our own ethical systems. Maternal nurture is, of course, present in all mammals, but in the apes and in us, it's very, very strong and very recognizable in the apes as being the same kinds of feelings that we have. There's also group nurture. So this little guy is being played airplane, and the person doing this is his aunt. It's not his mother. So all of the members of a troop get together and play with and help rear and educate the little babies. Friendship is huge. Here, a manifestation of it is who grooms whom, and friends are made and protected and fought for if they are being messed with, and it's a very large part of an ape's life. Here's Lucy on the right, who has a boo-boo, and her little brother is looking at it and concerned. And evidence for empathy for others is huge in ape cultures. So the antiquity of our moral sense, I think, to me, is is very strongly suggested by our understanding of our ape kin. And then we can go here and say that what humans do is they have these primate moral sentiments, but we experience them symbolically. So these ape sensibilities have not been left in the evolutionary dustbin, nor should we say that they're experienced as apes experience them? They are experienced as human minds experience things, which is symbolically and in narrative form, but they're deep within our being. A key part of a religious naturalist orientation that we've been given its own word is eco-morality, seeking right relations between the earth and its creatures based on our interrelatedness, our interdependence, and responsibilities. So we've seen our interrelatedness in all of those slides earlier. And we have interdependence in all of the parts of the planet and responsibilities for them. So eco-morality entails several things, I would say. It entails an intimate knowledge of the history and the workings of the natural world. So astronomer Timothy Ferris has a wonderful quote. He says, "There's some environmentalists that will do just about anything for the environment except take a science course." I love that. An understanding that humans and their cultures are part of the natural world is key. And accepting and then rejoicing in one's critterhood, one's connectedness with all other beings, and all of those countless beings who died for us, who came before us. So here's an example of the interdependence. A tree out in my yard where there's moss, there's fungi, there's lichens. They're all living together and working to have common interrelated lives together. So to repeat, a naturalist takes nature seriously. A religious naturalist takes nature seriously, might capitalize it. And a key piece here for me is that a religious naturalist also takes nature to heart. So Loyal Rue has a wonderful phrase in his recent book about what it means to take something to heart. If I were to say that I have taken the Quran to heart, you might infer that the teachings of the Quran now shape how I think, feel, and act. I now take Allah's will as my own, and I have a newly clarified sense of who I am, where I came from, and where I am going. Taking the Quran to heart alters the fabric of my self-understanding. It shifts my teleological center of gravity, and I operate differently in my efforts to live in harmony with that reality. So taking nature to heart then entails this kind of existential shift. Taking nature to heart means that your heart can be broken. Beijing a few months ago. Climate change, there on the right is a scene in 1928 and in 2004. Disasters like the BP oil spill. Children in India who make a living by going to dumps and finding objects. Taking something to heart means experiencing moral outrage when that is revered, when that which is revered is desecrated. And then, and here I really speak from my heart, acting on that outrage. So I'm going to close with two versions of religious naturalism, one without God language and then one with God language. I have no idea where the 8 of you come out in your current religious beliefs, and so I want to give you both perspectives. So this is something a bunch of us wrote up a while back. We find our sources of meaning within the natural world, where humans are understood to be emergent from and hence a part of nature. Our religious quest is informed and guided by the deepening and evolving understandings fostered by scientific inquiry and the mindful understandings inherent in our human traditions, including art, literature, philosophy, and the religions of the world. The natural world and its emergent manifestations in human creativity and community are the focus of our immersion, wonder, and reverence, and our common naturalistic orientation generates our shared sense of place, gratitude, and joy. We acknowledge as well a shared set of values and concerns pertaining to peace, justice, dignity, responsible freedom, the richness of ethnic, cultural, and ecological diversity, and planetary stability. We are committed to furthering the realization of these values and are convinced that the naturalistic perspective has much to offer in this process. Okay, so Phil Hefner, a longtime colleague and friend, wrote this a few years ago. I believe that evolution is the way that God has created the world. God has woven the creation on the web of emergence, adaptation, and natural selection. We are very far from understanding the significance of this aspect of God's creation, and also far from integrating this truth into our system of beliefs. Some think that attention to the sciences is to be feared, that it reduces religion and faith to molecules, genes, and neurons. On the contrary, it throws light on how God has created our world and what the actual purpose of faith and religion might be in the divine purview. Scientific perspectives can free faith, morality, and spirituality to be richer, more constructive, and, from a believer's perspective, more faithful. We have much more to fear if we ignore or reject them. All religions face the challenge and the excitement of engaging new ideas of nature and allowing their worldviews to be changed and enriched by this engagement. In this sense, all of us, regardless of our starting points, are called to take nature into our religious frameworks. We are called upon to be religious naturalists. Any viewpoint that does not attempt to take the measure of nature as we presently know it is in danger of becoming debilitating rather than enriching in all three of the religious spheres: the interpretive, the spiritual, and the moral. For those of us who begin with God, the challenge is to recognize that our scientific understandings are revelation of what God has done, what God is doing now, and what God intends. So, final slide in this part. A religious naturalist is anchored in and dwells within her understandings of the natural world. He finds religious orientation within that meta-narrative and develops mindful religious responses to it, interpretive, spiritual, and moral. Importantly, these responses often deeply overlap those espoused by existing traditions. The adoption of a meta-narrative does not necessarily alter the human impulse toward common spiritual and moral sensibilities. Rather, it influences how we get there. So, a group of us have been hammering together these little statements and talking about this, and I've been out giving talks to a number of people who've written books and articles. And a few years we talked about whether we should try to do something that brought people together. We tried several things, they didn't work. And in 2014, this guy, Michael Cavanaugh, who is a retired lawyer born and raised in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, of all places, brought up strict Baptist and converting to religious naturalist orientation. And because he's a lawyer, he said, we're just dicking around here. We need to start a nonprofit corporation. So he got all the papers pulled together, and we're now a 501c3 nonprofit. And we put up a website, and we started asking people to join for membership being free. And so what? It's now 3 years. We have more than 450 members from 48 states and 25 countries without doing any advertising or anything. So 450 members, it would be a large church congregation, pretty impressive one actually, given church membership. But of course, it's still a small group. But that said, we're on our way. It didn't die on the pad, and we're very excited. So the white panel is a screenshot of the website and the various things that you can click on. Above that is the URL, and Maximus is going to be sending out a PDF of this talk to you so you can go check it out yourselves. But a few pieces on it just to give you a sense. The Religious Naturalist Association, or RNA, pun intended, was formed to bring together people from around the world who see themselves as religious naturalists and to introduce this concept to those who are not familiar with it. This website provides a point of entry and a resource for exploring the religious naturalist orientation and for sharing ideas with other members. And we spend a lot of time on our website. It can, of course, be improved, but we have lots of links to books and videos and everything having to do with religious naturalists. We have a site for members' projects, meetings of interest, blah, 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 the usual thing that you would do. When we started up, we invited a lot of people who have been active in this work, including ones that I've been working with, and almost all of them agreed to serve as advisors. So here's our list of advisors. There are also several UU ministers who take on an RN orientation in their ministry. So what do we do? Well, we have to do the usual things. We have a Facebook page. We have a really active Google Groups page, one that's just general and one of clergy who have joined us from various denominations, mostly UU. We send out a monthly newsletter. A few meetups have happened, but they're hard to organize when we're worldwide, but we intend to try to get that to happen more. But at this point, it's just knowing that others exist, that we're not alone, that we have this kind of community on the planet. So let me end by going back to reading aloud perhaps the iconic poem for religious naturalists called Wild Geese by Mary Oliver. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees and the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. Okay, I'm out.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
So I'll wait for your screen.
I get back here. Here I am. Am I here? Do I?
You are, but you should turn your screen share off.
Turn screen share off. There I am.
You're back.
Ah.
So I'll start the conversation on I guess a little political note, but there was a sort of prediction, maybe a loose prediction that you made in your Religiopoesis piece, which predicted that any like very large religious naturalist movement of the future would have a very strong environmentalist piece. So I was wondering if you could comment on that in relation to the kind of religious activist movements we've been seeing, Standing Rock and elsewhere, and how that fits into this philosophical system.
Sure. Well, of course, the Standing Rock group are operating on their heritage. This is their land. This is where their people should be, and all of this bullshit should not be sacrificing it. It's kind of like where the moral outrage that I mentioned in talking about anyone who's in an eco-moral frame of mind. Now, the persons in Standing Rock are not functioning on scientific understanding of evolution and ecology, and it's certainly not the case that one needs to have that orientation in order to care about the earth. We know that's not true. But if one is using everybody's story as one story, then even if one doesn't have roots like the Native Americans do, even if one is stranded in, Columbus, Ohio, not Columbus, Ohio is fine. St. Louis, where I used to live. Even if one can't fall into those kinds of roots, one realizes that one is rooted in the entire ecosystem from all of these understandings that we have, and that offers a strong basis for environmental responsibility, concern, and activism. Is that?
Yeah, that's great. There's a little bit of a lag in this digital way, so conversation tends to be a little jumpy. But does anyone else wanna jump in? Okay, well, I have a number of questions that I wanted to ask you for quite some time. So I made a video for this class last week where I was talking about Judaism, and so I've been talking about religious metaphors. I've been working with this metaphor for some time, that there's a fairly rigorous correspondence between holy texts and genomes in terms of what genomes do for bodies and what holy texts do for societies. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts about that. How rigorous can that metaphor be?
Yeah, that works. I mean, it's an analogy. We can quickly come up with all the ways that they're different, right? Including the obvious one that genomes, at least until CRISPR-Cas came along, you don't change them quickly, whereas a text can, at least in theory, be changed. In the case of Judaism, could be changed in a generation, or at least manipulated over time in terms of how important it is to the service, how important it is to their understanding of what it means to be a Jew. And so the time thing is different. The ability to change it comes not from variation in natural selection, but from human thought. But in terms of providing a structure for how things are going to develop and turn out, it is a nice thought. I like it.
Yeah, well, I guess to push that forward a little bit, I've been looking quite specifically for what would you need to be able to say about a human group in order to claim that it has some sort of higher self, right? And you see it in religious language all the time. The church is the body of Christ and whatnot. We've used this metaphor for hundreds, thousands of years maybe to get people to work together. And so my curiosity is really is that more than a metaphor? Are there ways in which we can naturalize God by recognizing the cooperative tendencies that we have?
Well, of course, we don't have put God into it unless we choose to. I mean, there are many religious communities that, particularly in Asia, that don't have.
Right. Yeah.
But the idea of a social group as being a community as being an organism is, of course, a central thesis that David Sloan Wilson and others are pushing. I don't have any problem with the concept at all. It seems sort of like a no-brainer to me that that's the case. So I don't get all worked up about issues about it that some people do, like how do you actually select and how do you prevent cheaters and yeah. It works for me. But I think that all metaphors, for me, are most satisfying if they are metaphors. If we say, yeah, this is cool, and we don't try to, hammer them into being commandments and rigidify them. If they work for a person in terms of thinking about community and that helps, then go for it. But there's no reason to insist that everybody must buy that, because it's a helpful way of thinking, and because there are flaws in the analogy or places where the analogy doesn't work, it means that it is an analogy or a metaphor.
Yeah, could you say a little bit more about metaphor and what you think its role is for religious understanding?
Well, that was what I was trying to do in that piece. But you probably read it a while ago, and I read it even farther back than that. But it's just metaphor means to carry over. It means to take one thing and carry it over into another, and that's what all symbolic language is, all metaphorical, basically. I mean, it's an apple is not really an apple. It's a symbol for an apple. It's a metaphor for an apple. And so it's the way we think. It's the way we organize our understandings. And so when I think that humans would be a lot happier and more cooperative and productive and get along better if they did recognize that in the end we're dealing with metaphors. This doesn't mean that we don't know anything and that we're just running around with our heads cut off. It means that this flexibility of metaphors and adding to them and enriching them and making them more appealing and criticizing them is what cultural evolution really has been about, I would say.
That makes a lot of sense. But then there's this voice in my head that's like, okay, but the scientific edifice that we've created is based on like being super, super specific with our analogies and figuring out exactly when it isn't an analogy, but like when these correspondences are like numerically predictable and whatnot.
Yeah, okay. I mean, what scientists in order to understand anything, including a religious text, there is a part of that process that involves what this word that's often used as a pejorative, reductionism. Okay, you take the story of Noah, and if you really want to understand it, you read up on what other stories from Babylon and Mesopotamia and everything had floods in them, and you try to inform yourself about the Noah story. If you don't, I don't think you can say you really understand it. So you get everything you can, and you get this understanding of the story, and then you start looking at how it's written. You go to earlier versions of the Old Testament and see how it's been modified during translation and during its cultural evolution, so that the current Noah story may not read the same way. Well, why was it changed? Why was the metaphor changed? What were the scholars trying to do when they changed it to help the people understand the meaning of the Noah story? So in the end, there is no Noah story that you have to believe in order to be a good Jew.
Mm-hmm.
To be a good Jew, and I'm not a Jew, but I would say to be a good Jew is to take that story into your heart and mind and spirit and see what it is saying about understandings of God and God's will and the people of that time, and cherish it as a metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than think, if it's a metaphor, it isn't really true, or something like that. And that's not the point. The truth inheres in what the story is saying to you.
So, do you think that in these stories, there's something from what you were saying, you know, there's some like essential meaning that's not necessarily like unchangeable, but there's like something that the story is trying, kind of like a species, right? Like each animal is an iteration of this thing which is more general, which it's trying to represent. Is that like right? What am I trying to say here? Like, is that what we're supposed to do with these sort of things, is sort of try to pull out the core of them?
Well, I mean, I never use the word supposed, even to raising
Okay.
I would say that the option that makes the most sense to me is to work with the stories the way I had just talked about.
Mm-hmm.
Find their meaning, find their history, find what they mean to you, find what they mean to the group that is interested in them. But of course, there are orthodoxies. There are, not only in Judaism, but in all religions and in all social groups, where you're not supposed to think about it as anything except a law, anything except something that's completely inviolable. And I don't think that that's helpful or productive. It's just when you start fighting with each other about who broke the law. I mean, you're not even paying attention to what the law is saying.
Mm-hmm.
Can I chime in for a minute before we get off the topic of metaphor? First,
who are you?
I'm sorry. My name is Max.
Okay, hi Max. Oh yeah, I see. There's a little thingy that says Max. Okay, now I get it.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Ursula Goodenough, for joining us. I really appreciate it, and I'm honored to be able to speak directly with you. I want to ask you quickly just about a quote that I pulled out of the Reflections on Scientific and Religious Metaphor. And you said that the truth of all art is to compel someone to suspend disbelief so as to see the truthfulness. And I'm curious if you can speak more elaborately about that idea and maybe how that relates to scientific metaphor, and maybe that's something to do with how metaphors are used and how you want scientific metaphors to be used. I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah, well, as I said to Maximus earlier, I sent him that paper a few months ago. Or a month ago. I've been moving since then, and so all I'm thinking about is cutting brush and where to put the trash. But anyway, as I remember, I think that quote was in the context of the artist who was trying to put forth his or her own understanding of what is true and beautiful and good into a material form, be it a painting, a composition, or so on. And that for my advice was to go there and take in the work and find the truth that the artist was trying to convey. I think that the word truth is really tricky one. Scientists themselves will say this understanding is true to the best of our knowledge, given what we know now, given what the data tell us. They never say it's true and will never be shown to be anything other than this. That's just that's a no-no. And certainly artists don't feel that way. They feel very much as though, as I understand it from my artist friends, that they are just trying to express the truth as it comes to them. So did that get anywhere with your question, or?
That's good. That's great. I just have a quick follow-up question to that. And looking at the same text, you stated a few examples of scientific metaphors that I don't think that you felt were necessarily that strong, like gravity is love. And I believe there was another one. I didn't catch what the other one was. But I don't know if gravity is love was a bad metaphor because it didn't necessarily ring true. But I'm wondering if you have any other metaphors, scientific metaphors that you think do ring true.
Oh, okay. Well, the gravity is love one is that gravity and love don't have anything to do with each other. So, but then, as I recall, at the end of the piece, I said that the gravity of is love thing was terrific in that for people who might have been fearing gravity or feeling that gravity was some reductionist, mathematical, alienating concept. Instead, it brought that attraction, if you will, of gravity. Of course, it doesn't really work by attraction in the plus minus sense, but no matter. A metaphor that brings scientific understanding to somebody is a good scientific metaphor in my mind. And I tried to say that in the lab, when we're talking about our data, we use metaphors all the time. We draw little stick figures and use all sorts of language that is totally human. And if anybody taped it, they'd say, oh, these scientists are all heretics. They're all saying that this molecule is good for something, or you know, whatever. But
yeah, the cell is hitchhiking on the.
Right. That's how we communicate. And if I say that a gene is hitchhiking, everybody in the room knows what that means. And sometimes this blows up. So there was this whole thing about junk DNA. So people were talking about junk DNA. Nobody was really thinking that 95% of the genome was doing nothing, but it was junk in that it wasn't genes. And so the term junk came, and all of a sudden when functions started to be ascribed to some of those sequences, the journalists got so excited. Scientists thought this was junk and they were wrong, and scientists are so arrogant, blah, blah, blah. So we're kind of used to that, but we do use metaphors, and a metaphor that will work in a scientific seminar isn't necessarily one that's going to work in a Lutheran church basement, right? So one has to think of metaphors that will help deepen one's understanding and one's interest in the scientific worldview.
May I cut in?
Sure. Are you Amelia or Heather?
Mel.
Mel. Hi, Mel. Okay.
So I've been very compelled by the complex systems science view in recent time. So the contributions of Stu Kaufman and Terry Deakin and Harald Atmanspacher in terms of using complex systems theory, complexity science, to build a meta-theoretical framework in which we can understand all the sciences and not solve the problem of supervenience, but build a structure in which one science can be translated into another science at a different level of abstraction or a different scale. And I was trying to actually provide an introduction to that kind of view for this course on how we look at the mind and how we look at evolution as complex systems. Well, life and the mind as complex systems. And but I see a lot of balking at the notion of using complexity science from scientists because it implies a certain kind of epistemological chaos or anarchy or a lack of absolute truths, because there needs to be room for multiple truths in dialogue with one another, or able to be multiple truths that are not the same truth translating into one another. And the typical scientific worldview today doesn't like that so much. And it makes me think that that in like a Feyerabend or Thomas Kuhn's History of Scientific Revolutions, or in cultural evolutionary frameworks, there's this notion of truth as evolving and emergent, and changeable and multiple in form. And I'm wondering, it seems to me that the view of religious naturalism is very symmetrical to these views, is very much in alignment with these views. And I'm wondering how we can make science amenable to this broader perspective, to being compatibilized with other sciences in this way, without fearing epistemological anarchy, without fearing, the death of truth and reason and progress, but also without the necessity of a normative structure there that's all encompassing.
Okay, well, terrific. So I don't know whether you noticed on the advisor list, two of the advisors, one is Terry Deacon, another is Stuart Kaufman.
That surprised me so much.
And Terry is one of my 5 best friends. So
he's going to be speaking in a few weeks.
Yeah, I know. So yeah. Terry rocks, Terry rules. He's amazing. An alternative to the little spiel that I gave you in the slideshow is I have a whole hour's talk on emergence. And I call it emergence because it works better. But Terry has a whole emergent system, and complexity theory is in there. There has been resistance, and I think some of the resistance has come not so much from circling wagons, but several reasons from the emergence. Some of the people who were very vocal early on talking about complex systems also tended to be persons like Varela who were also very into Eastern mysticism and stuff like that. And so the scientists got, it was hard for them to hear what he was saying when they were also worried about whether paying attention to this was going to somehow compromise their credibility, that whole issue that I brought up in my piece on religiopoesis. But it is definitely, in the last 10 years, it has become mainstream. I can assure you. Everybody now realizes that what the evolutionary process, natural selection, it doesn't see genes, it doesn't see DNA sequences, it doesn't see proteins, it sees the emergent properties, it sees the whole phenotype, it sees the organism. That's what it's looking at and selecting. And I was on a search committee in the spring looking for a neuroscientist faculty member. And so I went to all of the seminars, and I don't usually tend to go to neuro seminars, usually because I don't understand them, because they're so technical. But they were presenting this incredible data where they, put a fluorescent protein in a particular family of neurons in the brain and watch how they migrated and where they synapsed, and what happens if that was affected by mutation. So all of this very reductionist thing. And what would invariably happen and was that someone would put up their hand and say, well, what's the emergent? So they actually used the noun emergent and as a shorthand for, okay, so once this pathway is generated, what does it do in terms of thinking, feeling, sensing, developing? And so it's when something becomes such a household word in a seminar that you don't even have to define by what you mean by it, then you know it's arrived. So I think that it's there, it's coming. I'm sure you can still find scientists who say, oh, those complexity theory people are just a lot of fuzzy-headed, whatever. But you can find scientists who are jerks in lots of places. And this has been accepted by all the people that I work with. Yeah.
So Nicole might be having some bandwidth problems. She typed a question. I want to give her a chance to try to unmute her microphone to see if she can speak up. Perhaps that can happen, maybe not. All right, well, what the question she typed was, she wants to know what your favorite myth was that helped you relate the most to the history of nature.
Oh, wow. The history of nature. I don't think fast enough to be able to do that. I mean, it depends. The history of nature, I can't do that in terms of a favorite myth.
Well, maybe at some point her bandwidth will improve and she can
maybe
clarify.
I mean, whether she means a book that I read that really helped, or I come back.
Yeah, we'll return to it.
Give me some help, because when I was a kid, I loved Winnie the Pooh, but I don't know whether that's the kind of thing she has in mind. I didn't become a scientist until I was in college, so I was mostly, I had goldfish and stuff like that, but I didn't really get into it until then.
Well, I have another question, unless someone else wants to go. Mel?
Oh, I was trying to ask if anyone else had any other questions.
Yeah, well, so going back to that metaphor of gravity is love, and what you said was basically like it's effective if you're in a Lutheran church and you're trying to convince a bunch of religious people the importance of recognizing a scientific understanding of the world. I'm wondering, so that's one part of the problem is, how do we bring scientific metaphors into religious communities?
Mm-hmm.
But then there's the inverse of that, which is how do we bring religious metaphors into scientific communities? How do we make our scientific understanding numinous, right? And what have you succeeded at all at that? I mean, because that I guess was the motivation behind the earlier questions I was asking about, like making claims about human groups as organisms, is like I'm trying to figure out how we can look at our factual understanding of the world and say, oh yeah, that's sacred, mm-hmm. and have that be like more tightly integrated in our theoretical understanding of what it is, instead of just like this gloss of like, oh yeah, here's the story, and by the way, doesn't it make you feel good? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I tried to do that in Sacred Depths of Nature. Have you had a chance to read that?
Yeah, I mean, it was a few years ago, but I did.
Okay. Well, I'm not going to ask you for any examples, but there I use metaphor all over the place in describing science. So I'm talking about a lot of stuff. My one rule was that I never bent the science or changed the science, so I didn't go as far as Brian Swim did with Gravity is God. Mm-hmm. But there's so many ways that you can talk about, like awareness, the awareness of a firefly to its mate's flashing. I mean, it is awareness. It's it works just like our awareness does, but a word like awareness, or a word like love, or a word like nurture, applied to what one sees out in the natural world is really helpful. And it doesn't invalidate the science at all. It just enriches it. Is that where you're going?
Yeah. I mean, that's
So,
precisely where I'm going.
Organism is it's obviously a bit more of a push, because organisms have very specific properties, and communities don't have all of those properties.
Yeah.
And organisms don't have all the properties of communities. So then you get to, an anthill, and is an anthill, are the ants individuals, or is the whole thing an individual, blah, blah, blah. But at least in the social insects, the whole idea of community as organism is much easier to convince people that that's not even a metaphor, that that's really true. The queen is the real deal, and all of the others are like cells in an organism. Multicellular critter.
Hi, my name is Denise.
Hi.
I would like to comment on Maximus said, because my family is they're actually very religious, and growing up, I was always taught, at the moment I said that I wanted to study biology, my parents and my pastor were actually really adamant about me pursuing biology as a major, because they said that it actually defies some of the ideas that I've been taught. So, we were taught like Adam and Eve were the first that inhabited the earth. And then once I studied biology, it was like, no, not Adam and Eve inhabited the earth. Homo sapiens were actually before us. So I wanted to ask you this question. Did you find that you were more successful trying to convince people in terms of like that practice different religions as opposed to like Muslim and Christianity? Or like, I don't know, do you know where I'm going with this? Because when I'm in church, some pastors, they speak against other religions. So I know, even though we may think we're in a cohesive environment, we're not really in a cohesive environment, because we try to not come together as like one religion. We kind of like segregate ourselves in terms of like religion. So I wanted to ask, like, did you find it more successful trying to convince another religion about your ideas as opposed to another one?
Well, so far my invitations to come and talk have come from quite liberal congregations. I have yet to be invited to a Southern Baptist congregation, for example, or lots of others where the whole idea is to fear and marginalize science and to say that it's the enemy. That would be they'd never invite me. Right? If they did, I'd go and I'd see what happened. I'd be fascinated. But the word on the street is that they just wouldn't want to hear anything I said, and they would only invite me to try to shoot down what I was saying, which I'd be very happy to experience and see what happened. And at the end, I might just throw up my hands and say, hey, we just got to agree to disagree. This isn't going anywhere. But I haven't had that opportunity. So let me ask you the question back. Where are you at this point in your journey in terms of that community versus other things that you're experiencing in college and reading and so on? Do you still consider yourself a part of that community, or are you backing away from it a little bit, or how are you organizing this?
So, ironically, I can't tell my mom because she won't allow me back in the house if I tell her.
You have this URL?
Because like the Bible was man-made, and Jehovah's Witnesses, they follow a lot of ideas from the Bible, as opposed to like me, I'm Baptist. I follow some of the ideas from the Bible, but I don't solely just follow everything from the Bible. I'm more like spiritual. So Jehovah's Witnesses, they don't celebrate Christmas because they say Christmas is not in the Bible, but we celebrate Christmas. So there's a lot of things that conflict on what we say. So I find myself to be more spiritual than religious because some of the ideas that have been proposed, I question it. So my journey throughout when I came to college, I've seen that I became more open-minded. I was very much ignorant to what was been going on, but that's only because I've been sheltered.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the ideas that's been proposed to me, I remember sitting down my first lecture in my bio class, my professor, he spoke about religion, and I was on the verge of raising my hand and saying, well, what you're saying is not true. And but instead I went and I spoke to my pastor. My pastor, his first resource was the Bible. So a lot of the times you'll find that most Christians, they use their Bible as their sole resource to explain the ideas of what's going on right now. So thankfully, I'm going through like these discussions. I'm being quite open-minded about what's being taught to me because it's allowed me to learn beyond what I've been taught. So yeah, so now I'm more spiritual than religious because I noticed that like.
Let me just take up that phrase because it's so common, particularly in your generation, to say I'm spiritual but not religious.
Yeah.
And in fact, a lot of people have said to us who are developing this, why are you using the R word? It's a toxic word. I hated my religion growing up, and think of all those pedophile priests, and I mean, they just go on and outrage just hearing that now in religion. And I've held my ground because as I tried to argue perhaps too many times in that talk, being spiritual is part of being religious, but it's not the whole deal. I mean, being religious, I would say, is also being moral and ethical, okay? Mm-hmm. And that's not the same thing as being spiritual and feeling awe and gratitude and humility and all of those spiritual responses. There's a whole moral component to religions that many writers, like Loyal Rue, for example, his whole argument is that religion, he has a book called Religion is Not About God. Mm-hmm. He thinks it's just has to do with educating the social emotions, is his phrase, and just a way through narrative, through these stories, of basically the society organizing people so that they're nice to each other and get along and all the things that we call moral behavior. And then the interpretive part. I mean, if you have a story, it's not just feeling great about it. It's taking it in. How does this work in my head? What do I make of my story? And in the Baptist tradition, of course, the story is the biblical one, and the pastor is interpreting it for you. Mm-hmm. But in sermons and Bible study and all of that, you're learning how to interpret this stuff. If you even get interested in the scientific worldview, if you will, nobody's offering any interpretation at all. Silence. So you get to do it, or you get to listen to folks like me who, can say, here's where I come out. And then you should for sure read 40 more books and see where other people come out and then come to your own conclusion.
Can I ask you one more question?
Of course.
Do you believe that individuals will still have morals without religion?
Well, of course, what I'm proposing is religion. So I'm proposing, I think that humans are inherently set up to be religious because they are set up to be moral, I tried to argue. Mm-hmm. We have all of these emotional parts of ourselves that respond to with awe and wonder and reverence. That's not taught, that's there. That's elicited not only by religions, but by artists, by everybody that's trying to get our attention. So I think that if religion, and even like Marxism and communism, where religion was forbidden, right? You know, it was the opiate of the masses and yada yada. They just substituted another religion. I mean, Marxism, if you start thinking about it and how all of the moral edicts that it imposes about equal distribution of wealth and all persons, I mean, most of the Marxist societies didn't do so well in practice along those lines, but lots of intentional communities, even if they don't use the R word, are in fact, to my mind, religious. So I'm sticking with the word, even if it means that maybe more people would be listening to what we have to say if we didn't use it. Because in the end, I think it's the important word. It means, so ligate means to tie together. It's the same anchor as ligament that ties bones together. And religate means to bring back together again. And I think that says a lot more about where we really should be going than that we feel spiritual when we see a sunset. I mean, I think feeling spiritual when we see a sunset is great. I'm a sucker for sunsets, but it can't be the whole of our religious life. So you can go back to saying you're spiritual, not religious, if you want to, but that's my.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Can I ask? Sorry, was someone else going to talk?
No, go ahead, Mel.
Can I ask? This is maybe, I don't know. This is maybe an overly personal or selfish question, but my two fascinations personally for a long, long time have been what's unique to the human mind. So this trying to piece together our minds as symbolic relative to the rest of, organisms, and their kind of mindedness, and this narrative self and our, unique in quality, if not unique in existence, human phenomenological consciousness and sense of free will and agency in real time. And then, so trying to understand the human mind, and then also trying to bring together a meta theory of sciences and I so like an epistemological worldview, and I only know how those relate for me in their, like, in metaphor, in their symmetries to one another, but it's not a real causal link, these two fascinations for me. And yet these seem to be the fascinations of a lot of other people. People seem to gravitate towards these two questions. And I'm wondering how you see the connection between these two questions.
Okay, so I got the first one, which is how does the mind work, basically. What was the second one?
Yeah, well, I guess they're both kind of how do we know things.
Okay.
But one of them is like very material and small, and one of them.
Can I try to condense?
Yeah.
So I think the two is, one is what is unique about being human, and the other is like how do all of our theories of the world hang together? Maybe.
Yes.
Is that what you mean, Mel? Okay. Well, okay. So obviously they can be considered separately, at least for openers. So for me, so first of all, nobody has any idea how the narrative self is generated. Okay, clueless. There's nobody understands it. Okay, so anything you read is an idea, and that idea will be based on this or that study or this and that religious text or whatever it is, but nobody can tell you how it works. What's interesting, though, is that, so I think it's emergent. I mean, it's got to be emergent, obviously, and so there's a perfectly good brain in there that is like a monkey's brain or a dog's brain, and somehow something happened that generates this theater that we live in, okay? And language seems to be important, and that's symbols and everything, but that doesn't tell you very much. But nobody knows. So, but let's do this thought experiment. You wake up tomorrow morning or maybe a month from now, and scientists at the Salk Institute have discovered how the narrative self works. They have shown that XY neurons interact with XY hormones, interact with XY blood flow, interact with X, and here's how it happens. And it's been replicated in 50 laboratories, and there's absolutely no question that this is what happens. Okay? So let's say that happens, and I'm not saying it couldn't. Your experience of your narrative self would be completely unaffected by that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so I can do it now. Since I'm who I am, I'm sure it's going to be something like that. I mean, I don't have spirit thing, but after I read it, I'll say, well, that's interesting. Huh, what do you know? But the thing about the narrative self is that it feels spiritual, right? It feels virtual. It doesn't feel material at all. It feels like it's coming out of the ether. And so that's why it's so difficult for people to think that it's brain generated, because it's just impossible to say that. And so since we don't know how it is, people say, well, you don't know how it is, and maybe it's not going to be based on neurons at all. But even assuming that it's made of neurons, I don't feel like it's made of neurons. It just doesn't feel that way. So, but that's okay. Terry Deacon has a wonderful phrase on that in a piece that he and I wrote on emergence. If any of you are interested, it's a lot of people think it's the best thing out there on emergence. And he said something to the effect that the fact that our conscious experience, as opposed to what the rest of the brain is doing, feels immaterial is not unexpected within an emergent phenomenon. It just is an illustration of how emergence can distance the next thing from the details below. So the details below are doing this, and when they come together, something else happens. That's the emergence paradigm. And in our case, in our minds, it happens to be something that doesn't feel like it's coming from the brain at all. And people, in fact, used to think it came from the heart or from the liver or something, because it doesn't feel brainy. Whereas I don't have that much trouble thinking the brain controls my arm movement, but just because I understand that it's unconscious, fortunately. If I had to think about every breath I took, it would I'd never be talking to you. So anyway, that's my first part. And I don't know whether that's satisfactory, but that's where I am on that. I find that the understandings that are coming in from physics and chemistry and cosmology and anthropology and everything else are generating a really coherent worldview for me. That story works. It doesn't seem in pieces. So maybe it would help me, to give me an illustration or explain more what it is that you're needing to pull together that feels unpulled together?
Well, yeah, I guess to me, it feels acceptable for multiple levels to describe different phenomena, multiple layers of abstraction, multiple theories, multiple methodologies to explain different properties of the same system, right?
Yeah.
But then for a lot of folks, I think it seems like the sciences are giving incompatible, competing theories. Like being in evolutionary theory, there's so much contention there. There's so much.
Give me an example.
Well, like the split between,
like the organismality debates or levels of selection debates, or the debates over cooperativity and prosociality and altruism. They get really, really, really heated. Or
I think the big divide is like humanities, like trying to bring evolutionary thinking into the humanities, and all the sociologists and the anthropologists just find it anathema because it's too reductionistic or denies free will or something like that.
Wait a minute, the sociologists are mad at the humanists, or the humanists are mad at the sociologists?
No, the humanists and the sociologists are mad at the evolutionists. That having recognizing our animality is not something that.
Well, they just have to get over it. I mean, it's not easy, right? I mean, I remember it was a film that somebody made, and they were, I think it was one of Brian Swim's movies, and they had a woman, and she said, evolution is wrong. There's no way I was ever a worm. And when she said worm, the disgust on her face was so palpable. If that's how she feels about worms, then she's not gonna go there. And I don't know what to say to help her out. Go out and hang out with some worms and figure out how cool they are. But we have a long way to go. But that doesn't mean that you don't try to. Okay, so somebody talk, because I just got a.
Maximus, I think.
Yeah, Maximus, you guys talk to each other for a second.
Yeah, what do you want to say, Mel?
I think also evolutionary scientists have generated a lot of garbage, and there's a
like what?
Well,
science or people who are interpreting evolutionary understandings.
People who are interpreting evolutionary understandings, but then they become the spokespeople for the evolutionary understanding.
Well, there's nothing we can do about that as scientists. I mean, it's a free country, and so it's frustrating. But you just go ahead and keep on saying, "Hey, that's not the QED here, folks," and hope that some understandings will.
Yeah, well, so I want to, you mentioned something similar to that when you were responding to Kenise a few minutes ago. And just like, I guess what we're trying to do in this channel, to whatever extent that we are able to do, is to do that work of science communication. And you sort of hinted at it, but I guess I would like to hear you elaborate a little bit more. Is like the standard view of what science is that it's decidedly morally blind. That like you go and you do your investigations and you figure out what it is the way it is, but that you don't put your humanity and your social position into the research that you're doing. And it seems like you take disagreement with that, but I'm wondering if you could probably be more articulate about it than I am.
That's not our job when we're in the lab. We're, you know, specifically supposed to be paying attention not to ourselves, but to the critters or the process or whatever it is that we're studying. I mean, it's like Buddhist meditation. When you're trying to do that, you're supposed to leave yourself behind, right? You're supposed to get rid of all the rada. And the same is true when you're really doing good science. You want to figure out how something works, and you have an idea of how it works, and you have a way to test it, and you do it, and all the things you learn about the scientific method. That's right. And then you get an answer, and you publish it, and there it is. Okay, and then that answer, if it has sociological relevance or environmental relevance, then it's the whole planet that's supposed to pay attention to it. You're not supposed to then march out and say, this is bad, this is good, this is right, this is wrong. You're supposed to get into dialogue with all the stakeholders and all of the people who might be impacted by this information. So the information and getting it, I mean, it really is true. It's just a different activity from figuring out what to do with it. And people who say, oh, the scientists should figure out what to do with it, and they shouldn't have even asked the question because it got this awkward answer, they just haven't thought it through. I'm not blaming them, but somehow we have to better communicate that nature is nature. Nature just is, okay? And we're trying to find out about it. And we're telling people what we find out. And then the cultures have to figure out how to incorporate that understanding. And that's where I am. I mean, xenophobia is a good example, right? I mean, we are inherently xenophobic. You can go back and you see troops of other primates who have wars with each other, and they get mad at each other, and little chimps that grew up together and were cousins and then joined different troops are suddenly killing each other. Well, we see that in humans too. Okay, so does that mean that xenophobia is right? I don't think so. But it's something that we have to be educated about to understand that we come with these biases and that they're in fact stupid because we all share common ancestry. All of us were once black-skinned and living in Africa. And when you learn those things, then even though some of the emotional wiring may still be there, it can be countered by something that is a scientifically ascribed and documented fact based on our genetic similarities. So I think it can do good as well.
So we're nearing the final minutes of this conversation. I'm wondering if anybody else wants to jump in. There's a couple more things I'd like to ask, but want to give maybe Nicole. It looks like your internet has improved. Do you want to try to speak up?
I'm sorry about all the background noise.
No problem.
Would it be better if I wrote any of the questions that I had in the chat?
The background noise doesn't bother me, okay?
Oh, okay. So my bandwidth was off in the beginning, and I didn't really hear anything that you said in response to the question that I wrote in the chat. So I was just very curious about, I guess, what was the biggest work that influenced your writing and your, I guess, theories and your studies? Like,
so I got that question, but we didn't, or I at least didn't understand what you mean. So you mean like what book or what
I guess
person or what?
The event or like the precipitating thing that like set you on your path towards combining like the world of metaphors and the world of like, I guess, more abstract ideas and thinking to biology and very like tangible and visible things.
Okay. Well, I mean, you can pick it up on Amazon for 45 cents, I think, or something, but I wrote this book called The Sacred Depths of Nature, and I described the process a little bit that led it to me. But in a word, I just happened upon a meeting that I went to for other reasons, and people were talking about some of the relationships between religion and science. I'd never thought about them at all, and that would have been in 1987, let's say, so quite some time ago. And my kids were, you know, out of being babies anyway, and so I had more time to do this kind of thing. And so I started going to meetings of this particular group, and it was really, there wasn't any one thing that I read that sealed the deal. This guy, Loyal Rue, Loyal, his first name, and Rue is his second name. He wrote a book that is, I think, out of print now, but it's called Amythia, where he talks about this idea of myths as being the root of culture, and that the problem with our time is that we have this planetary interactions with each other, but we don't have a planetary myth. Mm-hmm. And we don't have anything that we can use as a basis for making political and economic and moral decisions, because we're all rooted in different metaphors, and in different root metaphors. And then Loyal became one of my closest friends, and so that whole way of thinking has never left me. So if you want to read a fun book, get a copy of Amythia. It's really great stuff. And he wrote other.
If it's okay, I have just one other question. Yeah. So I read some of your work, and you speak a lot about kind of the overlaps between religion and metaphor and science. Are there any areas that you think in either of the three fields where they're irreconcilable, where you can't overlap them, where they kind of exist in their own kind of worlds and don't connect? Or do you think that there's a complete overlap between all three?
Well, in the end, we still have unanswered questions, right? So it's pretty irrefutable that the Big Bang happened, but why did the Big Bang happen? What happened before the Big Bang? Are there other universes besides ours? Whole lot of cosmology is just, there are no answers to it. And so what I do with that, and what I did with that in this book, is just say, cool, there's mystery. And I call it a covenant with mystery, and just say, all right, this stuff that we don't understand and maybe never will understand. And rather than get my pants in a wedge about that, I like mystery. Mystery is cool. Mystery is part of existence. So that gets me at least off the hook for some stuff. And same with what happens after we die. I happen to think we just die and that's it, and that life is what it is, but don't know. I'll find out at some point, or I won't, because when I'm dead, I won't feel anything. But that's okay. I mean, it's knowing everything is, as a scientist, that's never your goal. You know, you dissect your question down to some little tiny thing that you can do an experiment on. And so what I'd love to concentrate on is the stuff that we are understanding, the new ideas, the new things, and see how that fits into everything else.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Very much.
Okay, Maximus, you want to take us out with great thoughts?
Yeah, sure. I guess there was when you were quoting a pastor in your religious naturalism with God language. I don't recall his name. But there was a sentiment in there that basically amounted to, like, the role of science is to figure out God's word or God's will or something. And the first time I encountered that idea was when I was studying Isaac Newton's work and studying his alchemy stuff. And like, he had this very well articulated sentiment that, like, the role of the scientist, like, doing all these experiments was to figure out the word of God or you know, the truth of God or whatnot. And that is not the way that most scientists see themselves. And I guess a lot of the questions I've been asking you, what I'm personally trying to figure out is, like, what is the role of science in our society, and or what should it be, and what should its role be in our deeper understandings of who we are. And like, I guess, you know, I have a kind of nostalgia for, you know, I wish that science made these claims that they were there, or that there were some mode of knowing things that could tell us, like, this is figuring out the word of the divine. But you know, that's a romantic disposition.
Well, if you think that all of nature was created by God, I mean, if that's your starting point, which has to be the starting point of most believers in the Abrahamic traditions anyway, then that should be your perspective, right? Mm-hmm. You should be a Phil Hefner and say everything we're doing here is finding out how God works. There's an obvious problem, of course, in that a lot of the stuff that we're finding out about nature it's a pretty crummy fit between that which we're finding out and some of the things that are most near and dear to the hearts of believers, mm-hmm. like after death being an example, right? So you have to do a little bit of stretching to say that there's a soul and it goes up and all that stuff. And you have to worry about, well, do dogs go to heaven? And I mean, there are all sorts of questions that arise once you have a deep sense of how organisms function. And so you can do science without being a believer, which is the case with me. Or you can take these understandings and say that this is bringing us closer to understanding who God is, although the God that you're coming to understand is really different from the biblical dude who is jealous and starts wars and rain and all the other things that gods have been thought to do. It gets much more abstract. Or you can do what the pastor of anyway, one of the students, the one who talked about it, and say it isn't true. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, those are sort of your options.
Yeah.
And the guys in the middle who are trying to stay Christian or Jew or whatever, and also say that this is all believable, have the most work to do. I mean, that's a hard project. I admire them. I have it a lot easier.
Yeah, I guess we should end, but I guess what I'm wondering is more like, what do you think what do you think the role of a scientist should be? And maybe it should be exactly what it is.
I think as long as we're humans and we're curious about ourselves and about the planet we live in and so on, the more we find out about it, the wiser we are. I mean,
mm-hmm.
not, you know, and then you can go ahead and talk about curing diseases and all of that stuff, and that's all in there, and all the technologies that the physics and chemistry have bestowed upon us, and that's all there. But just finding out about how nature works and sharing that with other people doesn't need any justification in my mind. But any more than writing a poem or making a painting needs to be justified.
Mm-hmm.
Something I wrote down a sentence from when I was in Binghamton with you, Maximus, and we were discussing our goals for this course.
Mm-hmm.
What we hope to pull together with this course. And the sentence was, to me, science has never been the quest of an objective truth. Scientism has always been a process of familiarizing ourselves with the world that created us, a process of perpetually learning how best to create the world we want to inhabit. So it's sort of twofold for me, I felt.
Yeah, well, there's some things we can do, but nature's a pretty big, inexorable force. We can pave over some of it, we can pollute some of it, we can try to preserve some of it, but there's a whole lot that we have to go ahead and accept as being a bottom line. Nature could care less about us. I'm pretty convinced of that. And, you know, didn't have us in mind. That's an opinion. But
Well, thank you so much for your presentation and this conversation. It's been really...
Thanks so much for all your comments, yours and your students. I'm sorry some of you are not askers, but when I went to college, I wasn't an asker either. I was a listener. So.
Okay, well, I will make sure to link you to the videos that we make about your talk.
Okay.
And
have a great afternoon.
Thank you. Yeah, you too.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.